It's the Happy Families Podcast. It's the podcast for the time-poor parent who just wants answers now.
One of the best things about running the Happy Families podcast is the people I get to talk to. And today, somebody that I just love learning from and listening to. We're talking school today. And when I think about schools and education, I think about what's happening in classrooms. The person that I want to talk to is the founder and CEO of an organization called Real Schools. Adam Voigt is first and foremost a skilled classroom practitioner and a highly successful principal. He got his first principalship he earned his first principalship at the age of 35. He's personally led full school turnarounds and also the design and establishment of a brand new school as its inaugural principal. And his experience is peppered with lessons and case studies from a career spanning more than a quarter of a century in the classroom and in school leadership. What Adam doesn't know about making the magic of learning happen in schools is probably not worth knowing. And he joins me on the Happy Families podcast right now. Adam, thanks for being here to talk about schools. Pretty challenging place to be as an educator. And sometimes we feel like it's a pretty challenging place to send our kids these days.
Yeah, that's right. And my experience, and first of all, thank you so much for having me, Justin. It's really lovely. And they're very glowing words. I'll try to live up to it through the podcast. But I agree. I think it's a challenging landscape at the moment. I think that in my time, when I'm sort of at our time of recording this, it's now 30 and it's my 30th anniversary of being in government education. I first began as a preschool and prep teacher on an Aboriginal community in 1994. It's never been harder than it is right now, but it's also never been more important.
For parents who are feeling a bit stressed about it and teachers who are wondering what's going to happen here, I want to just highlight 4 things that we're going to talk about today in a very limited time frame. And I wish we could go deep for like an hour or two, but you're so pithy with what you have to say. We're going to talk about just teacher stress, especially in relation to additional needs. As a parent of an additional needs child, we've taken our child out of the school because it just wasn't working for her. But we know teachers are stressed. So we're going to cover that off briefly. We're going to talk about student engagement. And I do want to go on a tangent there and talk about devices, phones in schools. And we're also going to talk about a recent study that was published looking at how parents are pushing their kids in selective schools and how selective school attendance relates to life satisfaction as kids get older. So let's start at the beginning. Teacher stress is at record levels. We know that more teachers are indicating a preference to leave the profession in the next 12 to 48 months if they can. And we also know that parents of students, especially those with additional needs, are feeling increasingly uncomfortable sending their kids to school because it doesn't feel like a quote-unquote safe place. In fact, a quick story on this. I was talking to a parent just the other day whose grade 1 child with ADHD was locked in a storeroom, locked in a cupboard because the teacher couldn't deal with them. Obviously, this is not representative of what happens in all schools with all teachers. Most teachers are doing a great job. But what's your take on this, and how do we support teachers but also help parents to feel like the kids can go to school?
Yeah, so what we've known for a really long time, this has been the case for about 3 decades in Australia, is that the number one stressor of teachers is student behaviour. Now, if we make the class more diverse, if we make the students that come along more challenging, if we, for instance, have students with advantages placed in our independent and private schools, it means that our government schools, where the kids have the most need, the need gets more prolific. And when we don't support those teachers to kind of handle that need, so for instance, this goes to conversations around both pre-service teacher training, what sort of support they get. They don't get enough. They don't get enough of the practicalities. We've got too many teachers who are graduating going, I learned more in the first 4 weeks of teaching than I did in 4 years at university. And that's not okay. And then there's the in-career support and training that they get, which is often built around pressure around producing higher levels of student learning outcomes, which isn't the kind of care that a lot of people with the sort of kids that you're talking about who have additional needs, they're not looking for a 99 ATAR. They're just looking for a safe environment where their kid can learn to be a good learner in the company of other people. That's all they're looking for. But when we have more and more kids who have additional needs for that, the kind of basic skill set that a teacher has, it doesn't do it. Doesn't do the job. So we have to invest more heavily in them, or we can expect more of these kind of stories that sit on the outside of it. stories like cupboards that we just are unacceptable, but we can expect to have more of those come along because teachers are struggling as the work that's required of them becomes more difficult and the training that they have doesn't cope with that change. So really important that we kind of, as parents, that we're advocating for additional support for our teachers so they can do the job that's required of them better, and that we don't get kind of sucked into just in this kind of adversarial relationship with the school saying, well, you're not doing what I need for my kid, so I'm going to kick up a stink, I'm going to go to a department, I'm going to call a current affair, I'm going to get adversarial with you. It's actually the time that we need teachers and parents advocating for the same thing.
So if a parent wants to do that advocacy, I mean, the easy thing to do is to go and yell at the teacher or send an angry email to the principal. How do they do that? I mean, that's not the kind of thing that most parents are usually thinking about doing, is saying, how do I support the teachers at my local primary school or my local high school?
Yeah, I think that one of the most important things to do is that whenever we decide that we're going to need to talk to the school about something, and we should, if you're concerned, we should talk. But one is to understand that the people that you're talking to are experienced, qualified, and capable. And so the first thing we want parents to do is to seek to understand. We want them to ring the school and say, can you explain this to me? Because our lens for our own kids, and I know this, Justin, because I've got the call from the school to tell me that my kid has done the wrong thing at school. Yeah, and I got that call from a principal when I thought that this principal was ringing me to talk about principal-y things. And in my head, I was ready to go all irrational, all emotional, because we are emotional about our kids. Of course we are, but we need to understand that when we ring, we've often got an emotional hat on and we're not receptive to information that would put our minds at ease. So if we can, ring up, seek to understand what's going on, and then let's put the problem kind of on the whiteboard and let's talk about it. Let's see if we can solve it together. Be resources for each other rather than adversarials.
So valuable. Really appreciate that that suggestion. Let's move to a second idea. There's been some talk in the media recently, including an article that appeared on The Conversation, that some online platforms are starting to measure student engagement at school. What do you think about this idea? First of all, what do they mean by they want to measure student engagement? And secondly, is this what we need to be doing?
Yeah, I think that I'm a really healthy and fierce skeptic around this stuff. I think that our tech companies have hijacked the word engagement. And I think that what they're not measuring engagement. Engagement for me is young people who are listening, speaking, thinking, or doing.
Love it.
I tell every teacher that. And so the enemy of engagement then in a classroom, to be honest, is waiting. It's teachers who talk too long. Because most of the time kids are waiting to, can I just say something? Can I do something? Can I hear something? Can I get activated in my own learning? And we need them because if they're not activated, they're really hard to teach. So I think that these platforms, chiefly what they're measuring is young people logging in, young people accessing, young people being present. But you don't learn from being present. You learn from engaging. And so I push back against the idea that they're actually measuring engagement at all. Logging in doesn't mean I'm engaged. We've all sat through a movie that we weren't engaged with. We've all watched a television show that with our brains somewhere.
We've all sat in a Zoom meeting that we weren't engaged in.
I can drive in my car and listen to an Audible book, and all of a sudden I go, I've driven for the last 15 minutes. I hadn't heard one word. Yeah. So logging in or pressing play, that's not engagement. And I think we actually, as parents and as educators, we need to kind of be protective of the word engagement and say it's ours. Engagement is when you're getting the thrill of making dangerous, difficult progress, in a topic that particularly is going to be relevant or useful for you.
A cynical view of Kevin Rudd's education revolution is that everyone got a laptop and we just moved education onto screens but kept doing the same thing, maybe even more poorly. And technology is, it's everywhere in schools now. Is there too much tech in schools?
Well, I think there is when we start to see education, for instance, as a delivery or a distribution model. So I think that's what was the biggest risk, the biggest damage that was done by in education across heavily locked down communities like where I am in Melbourne, is that it became a delivery model. It became just, here's the content, I'll try and get it through the screen to you, and then you've got it, job done. That's not what high quality education is all about. And what we do know now is we've got, and obviously there are books at the moment like Jonathan Haidt's The Anxious Generation.
Great book.
An incredible, book that made me think a lot about my parenting as well as my role as an educator, showing us that the proliferation of technology, just because it makes certain parts of educating and growing young people easier, isn't good for them. It's changing not only the way they behave, but who they are. And that's something that I would love all our parents, all our educators to get their heads around, is that we are building young people for the future, not just trying to get certain things done in their company.
I'm talking to Adam Voigt from Real Schools. He's the CEO and director of Real Schools, I guess you'd call it a consultancy, really, looking after a couple of hundred schools around the country and helping educators to help kids to feel more engaged, help students feel more engaged at school. Let's go down this pathway of phones in schools, Adam. There's been a lot of talk over the last year or so, and governments successively and successfully removing phones from schools. Kids just aren't allowed to have them in most states and territories now, in both primary school and high school, in the public system at least. What's your take on this? Good or bad, and why?
So I'm a convert here. So about 5 or 6 years ago, I wrote an article that was published nationally in some of the biggest newspapers in Australia about how I think we needed to be more sophisticated about mobile phones in classrooms, and I think we needed to show kids how to use it for life because it wasn't going away, and I was wrong. So I have done the work that I've done more recently on trying to understand, like I said, about the way that these devices, and particularly the way that software that's designed for social media platforms that these kids are accessing way too early is doing them damage. The work that I've seen many of our schools that we work with do around, to be frank, complying with mobile phone bans, particularly our secondary schools, is that their teachers and their school leaders are reporting young people who are more present in their learning, more, to hark back to a previous conversation, engaged.
Love it.
In their learning. They're more attentive, they're more focused, and above any of that, they're happier. So they're telling us that their young people are actually enjoying getting a 6-7 hour break from having the Mark Zuckerbergs and Elon Musks of the world tell them what they should value and who they should hate. And I think that that's a good thing. So I've gone from being someone who was against a mobile phone ban, effectively, to being someone who's in favour. The schools that have done it best have been the ones who have engaged the kids in that messaging. I know one in Sydney who had no messaging about the mobile phone ban come from grown-ups. It was all the students. They got a group of them in who were influential, not just the student leaders, and said, how are we going to message this to the community, to our student community, so that they realise that this is going to be good for us and we're doing it together. They did a great job.
I feel like that's what education's about. I mean, this is great. I'm likewise. I've had the same evolution. I've flip-flopped a little bit, but primarily I've been saying we've just got to learn how to live with this. Couldn't agree with you more. Getting them out of the schools is absolutely fundamental and essential to increased engagement and well-being. All right, last question for you, Adam, as we move towards a wrap-up, and thanks so much for being so generous with your responses already. There was a study that was published recently and written about in the Fairfax Press about selective schools and life satisfaction. Essentially, the article claimed that parents are pushing their kids into selective schools, but whether you go to a selective school or not, and by the way, for those who are not familiar with selective schools, what that means is there are some schools that specialise in academics or sports or drama, and if your child is a high enough achiever, they get to go to that school rather than the local public school down the road. Life satisfaction, no impact, whether you go to the fancy hoity-toity selective school or you go to the local public school. That's what the research has found. What's your take on this?
Yeah, well, I guess one of the things that I do like is that we're now finally curious about life satisfaction as being a potential as being something that we're trying to set our kids up for while they're at school. And I think it's a good thing to explore that. And so what we do find when we look beyond what are the academic results that they produce in a particular year level in a particular, month, of a school year, and stop kind of making schools accountable for that and supporting them only to produce that, and actually say, well, what about way down in life? And not just like right at the end of the journey, not just a year or two later, but maybe 5, 10 years down, how satisfied are these young people with their lives because of the education they got? And what we're finding is that the longer view that we take, the more we are seeing a return on the investment of time and of money and of effort that a lot of parents are going to for getting that kid into a selective entry school or even an independent or a private school early in their lives. We mostly are acceding in these instances to some parental guilt, and which in Australia is well marketed. It's really easy to make a parent feel bad about not giving their kid every possible opportunity. But what these kinds of studies that are emerging are telling us is that actually providing our kids sometimes with a really nice level of productive struggle, of being able to be with people who are not exactly like them. Even like we've got selective entry, Justin, where they've gone to, say, a music school because they're particularly gifted there. The way to grow that gift is not necessarily to be just around kids who are awesome at music, but to be around and kids and talk to them and talk to kids who are going to be plumbers and listen to them about their music tastes and what floats their boat artistically. But being with a diverse group of people is really good for the individual. And there's a lesson here for policymakers around education as well, and that is that we need to make our schools diverse as well. They need to be places where people with all sorts of hopes, dreams, and backgrounds come together, because the world's going to demand that you work with different people to you, and so it's useful, this diversity at a scaled level, but it's also useful at an individual level. And I think parents can stop feeling guilty about not finding the perfect school for their kid, because it doesn't exist.
I feel like we've kind of come full circle. Our very first conversation was about the gap widening between the private and public system, where the haves and the have-nots, if I can use that crass term. Essentially, we're not getting the diversification in our education system, and we've kind of landed there again. Okay, Adam, I mean, anyone who's just listened to this conversation can see now why I would rather have 2 hours with you than 15 minutes. Really, really appreciate your time. If people want to know more, especially educators who are listening to our conversation, if they want to know more about you and the work that you do at Real Schools, where can they find you and what should they expect?
Yeah, they can head to realschools.com.au and they'll find out everything as an educator that we do with working with schools. And we work with schools for 3 years. So some schools ring up and say they'd like a PD day, train our teachers for a day, and our answer is no.
Yeah, that's my job. That's my job.
We're locking in. And so we help schools for the long term in a multitude of different ways. They're supported by an experienced principal. Every school that does it has an experienced principal allocated to them. And we're really proud. Our mission's to transform education in Australia and to do it one school at a time. So we're busy.
Good stuff. Really appreciate your time, and thanks for your insights. I'm sure that everyone really enjoyed the conversation. Thanks, Adam.
Not at all, Justin. Thanks for having me.
The Happy Families podcast is produced by Justin Rulon from Bridge Media. If you'd like more info, check out Adam's website, realschools.com.au. We'll link to it in the show notes. And of course, if you want to make your family happier and figure out how to navigate things just from a purely in the family perspective, check out my website, happyfamilies.com.au.